The Impact Ledger. Ledger. The Impact Ledger.
Welcome back to the Impact Ledger, the podcast where we decode the money, metrics, and motivations driving the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Carlton Barrow Reed III, from Meek Earth Studio. Have you ever wondered what happens when Wall Street tries to optimize a neighborhood soup kitchen? Today, we're looking at a massive seismic shift in how governments and philanthropists pay for social services. We're talking about billions, sometimes trillions of dollars moving through the global economy every single year. It's a massive question, really. How do we ensure that taxpayer dollars actually solve problems rather than just funding an endless bureaucratic loop of well-intentioned activities? To understand where we are today, we have to understand where we've been. For a long time, a very long time, essentially since the birth of the modern welfare state, the public sector operated on what's called a fee-for-service or cost reimbursement model. It was all about inputs, compliance, and filling seats. A government agency would pay a nonprofit based on how many beds they put in a homeless shelter, or how many hours of job training they delivered, or how many pamphlets about nutrition they handed out in a community center. Why did we do it that way? Because it's incredibly easy to measure. It's very simple for an auditor with a clipboard to walk into a room, count the number of beds, count the number of hours on a timesheet, write a check, and walk away feeling like they did their job. But here's the rub, and anyone who has ever worked a day in human services knows this intimately. You can deliver 1 million hours of job training, but if the curriculum is teaching people how to code in obsolete languages, and absolutely no one gets a job at the end of it, what did we really accomplish? We paid for the activity, not the result. We poured water into a bucket full of holes. The underlying problem of poverty or unemployment persisted, but the invoice was paid, and the bureaucracy was satisfied. To understand why fixing this is so unbelievably complicated, we have to look at arguably the biggest fault line in the U.S. nonprofit fabric right now. You have this massive yawning gap between the messy, non-uniform reality of grassroots structures on the ground and the large-scale standardized targets demanded by government funders at the top. Let's look at one side of that chasm, the grassroots nonprofits. These are deeply localized, often beautifully non-uniform organizations. They might run out of a church basement, a local barbershop, or someone's living room. They don't have a 50-page employee handbook. They don't have standardized operations across 50 states. But they are incredibly, unbeatably effective because they have authentic, lived experience, trust with the people they serve. If a kid is in trouble, they don't go to the mass regional bureaucratic office downtown. They go to Auntie Mary. I mean, we've all had our Auntie Marys at the neighborhood youth center because she knows their mother and she knows the streets. Now, look at the other side, the government's need for massive scale. To justify $1 million state or federal budget, policymakers need huge uniform outcome targets to be hit. They face political pressure, taxpayer scrutiny, and endless audits. They issue 200-page requests for proposals, RFPs, that require a team of lawyers and grant writers just to decipher. And if you're a nonprofit and you've had to decipher that, you know what I'm talking about. So the multi-million dollar question at the heart of our episode today is this: how do we bridge that gap? How do we plug the authentic, street-level power of grassroots organizations into large-scale government funding targets without forcing them to corporatize and destroying their soul in the process? Well, over the last 2 decades, a new buzzword swept through the halls of government, and high finance attempting to answer exactly that. It became known as outcomes-based financing, or pay for success. The idea is simple. It makes so much intuitive sense at first. Instead of paying a nonprofit for the number of job training hours they deliver, the government says we will only pay you if the person actually gets and keeps the job for 6 months. Makes sense, right? It sounds like basic, undeniable accountability. The poster child for this movie was an incredibly complex financial instrument called the Social Impact Bond, or Social Impact Bond, or SIB. It started back in 2010 with the Peterborough Prison Initiative over in the United Kingdom. At the time, the UK was dealing with a massive problem. Short-term prisoners, people serving less than 12 months, were reoffending and returning to prison at staggering rates. Recidivism is a great test case for this financial model, because a prisoner going back to jail costs the state a very specific, easily calculable amount of money. You know exactly what a prison cell, a guard's salary, and a court processing fee costs. Here's how a classic SIB works. Private investors, are talking about big banks, pension funds, or wealthy philanthropic founders, put up the upfront cash, in Peterborough's case about £5 million, to run an intensive rehabilitation and mentorship program. The government pays nothing up front. If the nonprofit succeeds in hitting its targets and keeps a certain percentage of people out of jail, the government repays the investors their principal, plus a healthy rate of return. Where does that profit come from? From the cashable savings the government just banked by not having to build another prison block. But this is a crucial part. If the nonprofit fails to hit those target numbers, the investors lose their money. The taxpayer is completely off the hook. They didn't pay a dime for a program that didn't work. In theory, it's a brilliant, almost utopian mechanism. It protects the taxpayer from paying for failure. It financially incentivizes real, measurable results, and it theoretically, frees up nonprofits to innovate because the government isn't telling them exactly how to run their program, only what the end goal must be. But I was reading a fascinating deep dive white paper today, and it turns out reality is a lot messier than a whiteboard at an economics conference. The unmitigated transfer of risk in traditional SIBs is actually crushing the very nonprofits they rely on to do the work. It turns out that taking all the financial risk out of the government and dumping it onto the private sector creates a shockwave that travels all the way down the contracting chain, and it ultimately hits the frontline social workers the hardest. Today, we're breaking down why the traditional social impact bond is fundamentally flawed, and explore the middle ground alternatives that are quietly replacing it to save the sector. Let's talk about the risks. The document points out that the idea that SIBs entirely insulate nonprofits from risk is a structural fallacy. Sure, the investor loses the capital if the project fails, but when you shift from a guaranteed fee for service to a strictly pay for success model, the nonprofits themselves face terrifying existential vulnerabilities. First, there's a sheer financial risk. Let's be brutally honest about the nonprofit sector. Most of these organizations operate on razor-thin margins. They aren't sitting on massive corporate cash reserves like Apple or Google, because what the industry because of what industry insiders call the overhead myth. Dynamic the Bridgespan Group famously identified as a nonprofit starvation cycle. A lot of these organizations barely have 30 to 90 days of operating cash in the bank at any given time. Donors push this toxic idea that 100% of their money must go to the program, and 0% should go to the electric bill, the HR department, or building a decent database. So imagine you put a fragile organization like that on a strict pay-for-success contract. If a government withholds even 15% or 20% of their funding because they narrowly miss a rigid, statistically defined metric by half a percentage point, it creates an immediate, catastrophic liquidity crisis. They literally can't make payroll next Friday. They can't keep the lights on. It's an incredibly stressful environment to operate in. You're asking people to doing the hardest emotional labor in our society to do it while constantly terrified of bankruptcy. Then there's the operational risk. Under a social impact bond, because private investors are demanding a return on their money, the standard of proof is incredibly high. You have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that your specific intervention caused a positive outcome. And it wasn't just a general macroeconomic trend in the local economy. To prove that level of causality, investors usually demand randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. Social policy experts and researchers publishing in places like the Stanford Social Innovation Review have pointed out the massive flaw here. RCTs might be the absolute gold standard in medical science and pharmaceutical testing, but they're an absolute nightmare for a grassroots or community center. To run an RCT, a nonprofit literally has to create a control group. That means taking a population of vulnerable people who desperately need help, flipping a coin and turning half of them away, just so the evaluators have a baseline to compare against the people who did get the help. Imagine being a social worker having to look a desperate single mother in the eye and say, "I'm sorry, you've just been randomized into the control group. We can't offer you services." It is heart-wrenching and it actively burns out staff. Suddenly, these small, culturally embedded organizations are forced to become massive data administration hubs. They have to buy six-figure Salesforce implementations, frontline staff, the social workers, the counselors, the teachers get pulled away from direct client care to deal with strict evaluation protocols, endless digital surveys, and rigorous daily data entry. It ends up heavily favoring massive, highly corporatized mega nonprofits who can afford to hire a dedicated data science team and a compliance officer, while entirely shutting out the smaller, neighborhood-based organizations who actually know, love, and trust the community. The traditional social impact bond basically looks at a grassroots organization and says, to get this funding, you need to look and act exactly like a Fortune 500 company. Therefore, to standardize, to build massive compliance departments, to adopt rigid operational manuals, and then at the end of the day, try to survive. But here's the tragedy of that demand. When you force a non-uniform grassroots organization to corporatize just to secure funding, you often destroy the exact secret sauce that made them effective in the first place. They lose their agility. They lose their cultural resonance. They become just another cold, distant bureaucracy to the people they are trying to help. And if we don't fix that tension, we end up with severe ethical risks. When a nonprofit's very financial survival is tied to strict statistical thresholds, you get what behavioral economists refer to as the principal agent problem. It changes human behavior, often for the worse. If you look at public administration theory, you see how survival incentives predictably distort social services. The document highlights a highly documented practice called creaming. Imagine you run a job placement nonprofit. You have a massive wait list, but you only get your funding for clients successfully secure and retain a job for 6 months. If you have to choose between two client applicants, applicant A is a client who just got laid off from a tech firm, has a college degree, a reliable car, and just needs a little resume help. Applicant B is a client who has been out of work for 5 years, struggles with substance abuse, lacks reliable childcare, and has a felony record. Who are you going to take into your program? If your organization's survival is on the line, you take the easy case. You cream the top of the applicant pool to guarantee you hit your metrics so you don't go bankrupt. In the process, you actively ignore the most vulnerable people. Applicant B, who actually needs the intervention the most, is left by the wayside. There's also the flip side of that called parking. This is where difficult clients are officially enrolled in the program, so the nonprofit gets a small initial enrollment fee to boost their numbers, but then those complex clients are quietly ignored or parked in the corner. Staff resources are intentionally diverted away from them and spent entirely on the easy wins who are guaranteed to trigger the big outcome payments at the end of the year. Or the organizations develop tunnel vision. Think about the phrase teaching to test in public schools, but applied to human services. If the strict metric that triggers payment is a teenager passing a high school equivalency math test, the nonprofit will focus purely on drilling math equations day in and day out. They entirely neglect the holistic well-being, the declining mental health, or the housing instability of the kid taking the test, because the contract doesn't pay for mental health. It pays for math scores. Math scores that don't teach you how to think. To fix these massive ethical and operational flaws, the sector is desperately developing three possible middle ground alternatives. First, we have tiered We have tiered payment schedules, which guarantee a baseline of funding that keeps the lights on while offering bonuses for success. Second, there are outcome rate cards, which act as a public menu of fixed prices for social outcomes, cutting out the expensive bureaucratic red tape. And third, community-driven outcomes contracts, which empower the local community, not distant bureaucrats, to define what success actually looks like. To understand just how deep this principal Asian problem goes, let's take a look at what behavioral economists call Goodhart's Law. Now, here is our first Gemini insight, where Gemini provides insights into what we just talked about. The behavioral shifts. This is Gemini. The behavioral shifts Carlton mentioned, creaming parking television, are classic examples of Goodhart's Law in action. Formulated by British economist Charles Goodhart, the law states when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. In comprehensive reviews of public sector contracting in the UK and US, researchers including public administration scholars like James Heckman, an analyst at the Brookings Institution, found that when employment agencies were transitioned to strict performance-based pay, found that when employment agencies were transitioned to strict performance-based pay, the placement of easily employable individuals spiked by 20%, while services for individuals with severe compounding barriers dropped significantly. The strict metric incentivized efficiency over equity. To counter this, modern economic framework suggests assigning weighted values to outcomes, offering significantly higher financial rewards for achieving success with the most marginalized populations, thereby using market incentives to reverse the creaming effect. That's Goodhart's Law for you. Okay, Gemini's done. That's Goodhart's Law for you. It's a fascinating, terrifying dynamic when you apply it to human lives. The first alternative is tiered payment schedules and milestone-based structures. This is essentially borrowing from standard corporate margin theory. Think about how a good sales job works in the corporate world. You're provided a base salary. That base salary ensures stability so you can pay your mortgage, buy groceries, and feed your kids without panic. Then on top of that, you have commission bonuses that drive excellence, hustle, and performance. In this nonprofit model, the government does the same thing. They pay a guaranteed baseline fee to the organization, regardless of the final outcome. This baseline covers their fixed, unavoidable operational costs: the rent for the building, the base salaries for the social workers, the utility bills, the insurance. That baseline completely eliminates the immediate liquidity risk and the institutional panic that leads to creaming. Then on top of that baseline, they layer on the outcome bonuses for hitting certain milestones. The Tennessee Department of Children's Services did exactly this, supported by research and technical assistance from the Harvard Kennedy School's Government Performance Lab, and it's a brilliant case study in how to do this right. They're dealing with child welfare and foster care providers. Historically, if a provider didn't hit a binary succeed or fail metric, like keeping a child in a stable placement for X amount of days, the state would just terminate the contract. But think about the human cost of that. Terminating a child welfare contract means you have to abruptly pull vulnerable foster kids out of their current environment, throw their belongings in trash bags, and move them to a new facility across the state, which traumatizes them all over again. The punishment for the agency became a punishment for the child. Let's read that again. The punishment for the agency became a punishment for the child. Instead, Tennessee put the providers into performance bands based on their results over time. Higher performing bands got higher blended daily rates. But here's the genius part. Instead of just gutting the contracts of lower performing organizations and disrupting care, the state used that baseline funding to give those struggling organizations a stable runway to improve their practices. It completely neutralizes the incentive to cherry pick easy cases, because the provider isn't facing total ruin if a tough case fails to trigger a payout. And exactly as the Gemini Insight just mentioned, governments can explicitly offer higher bonus tiers for achieving outcomes with the hardest to serve demographics, making the hardest work the most financially rewarding. The second alternative tackles the absurd transaction costs of traditional SIBs. Setting up a bespoke social impact bond is a nightmare of red tape. You have to get government lawyers, private investors, philanthropic foundation valuers, and the nonprofit all in a row to agree on terms. It can literally take 18 months to 2 years and millions of dollars in legal fees, consultant fees, and intermediary fees just to negotiate the contract before a single dollar ever reaches a person in need. It is incredibly inefficient. The solution to this friction? Outcome rate cards, or ORCs. Think of an outcome rate card as a public, standardized menu at a restaurant. Instead of negotiating a unique 500-page contract with every single provider in the state, the government does the math internally. They look at their historical budget and say, okay, we currently spend $50,000 in taxpayer money every time a child requires years of special education services. So we'll publish an open rate card offering to pay exactly $10,000 to any qualified provider for every child to successfully divert from needing special education through early childhood intervention. Or we will pay $5,000 for every healthy birth that avoids a stay in the neonatal intensive care unit. The state of Connecticut did this heavily with their early childhood home visiting program, working alongside advisory groups like Social Finance, who have been huge proponents of this model. By creating the standardized rate card, the transaction costs basically drop to zero. A nonprofit just looks at the public menu, pairs up with a working capital loan from a local community bank if they need to cover upfront costs, and gets to work immediately. The government stops micromanaging the day-to-day operations. They don't care how you achieve the outcome, whether you use a proprietary tablet app, text messaging, or an in-person home visit, as long as it's ethical and legal. They just buy the verified result at the end of the line. This is the perfect bridge for the grassroots organization. It democratizes access, allowing smaller, non-uniform, minority-led nonprofits to plug into large-scale government funding without needing to fundamentally change their structure or hire a team of Wall Street lawyers to represent them. Our research team actually pulled some fascinating historical context on this exact economic principle. Time for our second Gemini Insight. The outcome rate card operates on the economic principle of the monoponistic pricing. A monopsony occurs. A monopsony. Oh yeah, a monopsony occurs when there is only one major buyer in the market. In this case, the government purchasing social outcomes. As articulated by policy groups like the Urban Institute, by publicly standardizing the price they are willing to pay for an outcome, this government's drastically reduced market friction. Historically, the introduction of rate cards in sectors like public health and workforce development has led to an acceleration of innovation, because providers are no longer constrained by rigid fee-for-service rules that dictate exactly how they must perform a task. They are free to experiment with novel, lower cost or higher impact interventions. The rate card essentially creates a competitive marketplace of ideas, where the government acts as a passive buyer of success, rather than an active micromanager of processes. Right, a passive Gemini is over. Right, a passive buyer of success. I love that phrasing. It shifts the government from being a hall monitor to being a genuine investor. Now, the third alternative is probably the most revolutionary of them all, because it directly resolves that tension between the grassroots and the top-down power structure. It goes beyond just changing how the money flows. changes who holds the power. It's called the Community Driven Outcomes Contract, or CDOC. Traditional pay for success is incredibly top down. Think about the power structure of a standard SIB. Distant government bureaucrats, high net worth investors from major financial centers, and elite academic not evaluators sit in a boardroom hundreds of miles away. They look at a spreadsheet, define the metrics of success, and then impose those metrics on a marginalized community they've never lived in and barely understand. It often fails because it fundamentally lacks cultural resonance. It doesn't map onto the reality of the street that people live on. CDOCs flip that entire model upside down. A great example detailed in the paper and frequently highlighted in journals like the Stanford Social Innovation Review is the Minoyan Initiative. This program targeting the management and prevention of type 2 diabetes in the Anissinaabe First Nation. Anissinaabe First Nation, that's a tongue twister. An indigenous community in Manitoba, Canada. In a traditional top-down model, the government would just measure success by tracking Western clinical metrics, lowering A1C blood sugar levels, or counting the number of clinical visits to a doctor per month. But here, the community itself initiated the contract, and they defined the success metrics to ensure they were realistic for their specific geographic, historical, and cultural environment. This community, success didn't just mean sterile clinical compliance. It meant integrating traditional foodways. It meant measuring how often community members reconnect with ancestral lands for harvesting traditional foods. It measured cultural practices and community cohesion as direct indicators of long-term health. It creates deep, profound psychological ownership. And it's removing what academics call epistemic paternalism from social finance. An epistemic paternalism is just a fancy way of saying, we know what's best for you, so shut up and do it our way. CDOCs violently reject that notion. They operate on the premise that the messy, non-uniform grassroots people inexperienced the problem are actually the best groups best equipped to design the solution. Furthermore, these community contracts often include a co-investment mechanism. The local community might not have millions in cash to put up, but they contribute non-monetary assets. They contribute local labor, thousands of hours of volunteer time, physical community spaces, and deep social networks. This builds domestic capacity and physical infrastructure. That way, when the specific government grant eventually ends in 3 or 5 years, the program doesn't just instantly collapse into dust, because the community actually built it and owns it. And here is our final Gemini insight. A shift toward community-driven outcomes contracts mirrors a broader movement in global health and international development known as participatory design. Research from organizations like the World Bank and USAID consistently shows that when target populations are excluded from the design phase of an intervention, the long-term sustainment rate drops precipitously. Interventions that utilize decentralized power dynamics, allowing local leaders to define both the problem and the acceptable metrics of success, show a 40% higher rate of long-term survival post-funding. This is because localized metrics account for undocumented community norms, historical traumas, and informal support networks that distant evaluators instantly overlook. Carlton here. That 40% survival rate is a massive number. Proves that respect, cultural humility, and autonomy aren't just feel-good progressive concepts. They are actual hard-nosed drivers of economic efficiency and program survival. To wrap this all up, the document stresses one incredible vital point. None of these middle ground alternatives work in a vacuum. You can design the best, most equitable, beautifully written contract in the world, but the broader financial and governmental ecosystem isn't supportive, the contract will fail. They need what the paper calls systemic enablers, things like catalytic first loss capital. If you aren't a fan, the concept of a capital stack can be confusing. Basically, when multiple people invest in a project, they get paid back in a specific order of seniority. First loss capital is the very bottom of the stack. Think of it like an insurance deductible. If you crash your car, you pay your $500 deductible first, the foundation's money, shielding the insurance company, the private investors from taking the initial financial hit. This is where philanthropic foundations step in. Organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Global Impact Investing Network have written extensively on this. Because foundations are driven by a social mission rather than just squeezing out market rate financial returns, they can take the highest risk, most junior debt position. If a project fails and loses money, the foundation's money is wiped out first. It acts as a financial shock absorber. This provides a massive shield from the nonprofit, and crucially, it makes more traditional highly risk-averse private investors comfortable enough to join in because they know the foundation will take the hit before their money is touched. Then there is active contract management, a practice heavily championed by the Harvard Kennedy School's Government Performance Lab. Traditionally, the government contracts involve a dreaded, highly punitive annual audit. It's a gotcha game where the government auditors show up once a year to look in the rearview mirror and penalize you for mistakes made 9 months ago, when it's entirely too late to fix them. Active contract management replaces these autopsy-style audit with high-frequency, collaborative data meetings, sometimes weekly or bi-weekly. It's more like agile software development. The government and the provider sit down, look at the real-time data dashboard together, and ask why a specific metric is slipping, and pivot the strategy immediately. It treats the contract like a living partnership, aimed at solving a problem, not a legal trap waiting to be sprung. And finally, hold harmless periods. Groups that actively structure these kinds of complex government contracts, like third sector capital partners, constantly push for this. Think of it like the runaway a tech startup gets when they secure venture capital funding. It's essentially giving nonprofits a 12 to 24 month grace period at the start of a massive contract where their baseline funding is entirely guaranteed, regardless of their early outcome numbers. It recognizes a basic, undeniable operational reality. Building new data infrastructure, migrating software, hiring new staff, and changing deeply ingrained organizational habits takes time. It gives them a safe sandbox to figure out their new workflows, make early mistakes, and course correct without staring down the barrel of bankruptcy on day one. And that's what brings us to Carlton's Corner, where I give my 2 cents of the day. Look, managing a massive government contract with a social service nonprofit is like managing a team in the corporate world. Psychology and management, the way human beings respond to incentives and fear is universal. Think about it. We stand over your employees' shoulders with a stopwatch, tracking every single keystroke, demanding a status update every hour and threatening to fire them if they miss a missed quota by an inch. What happens? You're going to get incredibly high compliance, sure. They will check all your boxes, they will fill out all your forms, but you will get absolutely zero innovation. Nobody takes creative risks when they have a gun to their head, because fear is not a motivator. It's not a good motivator. It's not a sustaining motivator. And it's not a healing motivator. And worse, eventually, human nature takes over. Survival instincts kicked in, fight or flight, and they'll just start gaming your system to get you off their backs. They'll cream the easy cases, they'll park the hard ones, they'll teach to the test. You will get the illusion of success, but the underlying rot will remain. The traditional social impact bond in its purest, most rigid form was the ultimate government stopwatch. It operated on a deeply cynical assumption that nonprofits needed the imminent threat of financial ruin to do good work. It assumed that without a Wall Street investor holding their feet to the fire, they just slack off, mismanage the funds, and fail the community. But these middle ground alternatives we talked about today, the outcome rate cards, the tiered bonus structures, the community-driven contracts, they represent a massive fundamental shift towards actual trust. It's the public sector finally looking at a nonprofit, treating them like competent, dedicated professionals in saying, we agree on the destination. We've agreed on what success looks like. Now we're going to step back and give you the resources you need and let you figure out how to drive the car. I'm a guy. I'm just a guy. But the history of public spending is littered with corporate buzzwords that promise to fix everything and ultimately fix nothing. But I have to say, this evolution makes profound sense to me, the guy. We're finally moving away from hyper-financialized, adversarial, gotcha-style system and moving toward a truly collaborative engine. We found a way to let grassroots organizations remain authentically grassroots while still hitting the large-scale targets the taxpayers rightfully deserve. At the end of the day, you simply can't ask someone to go out and save the world while simultaneously threatening to shut them down and turn their lights off forever. That's it for this episode of the Impact Ledger. If you want to dive deeper, stay tuned for episode 2, where we discuss community-led outcomes-based solutions in greater detail and what the future should and could look like. Thanks for listening. Keep asking the hard questions. We'll see you next time.
The Impact Ledger.